Bottom line, if I had to mix broadcast in the box, I'd do it with this program and a fader controller, and I'd be happy. Today I'm doing a review of Harrison Mixbus as a way to mix a live broadcast for your church. I'm not reviewing all the recording and editing features because that goes beyond what we're going to use for just virtual sound check and playback. I did another review of the program for using as a way to practice mixing at home. You can find that video's link in the description below. If you want analog style mixing inside a digital audio workstation with all the bells and whistles of mixing inside the box, then this program is definitely one you'll want to check out. Hey, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and ding the little bell to get notified every time I post a new video, because I'm here to help you make every worship mix an enjoyable one. Harrison started out as an analog console company. Their old school analog consoles were used on a ton of major hits, and their newer consoles are really popular in film mixing. All of that analog mojo made its way into this digital audio workstation, and I love every bit of it. So forgive me if I'm a little too giddy in this review. There are two versions of this software. There's Mixbus, I'm reviewing version 6, and Mixbus 32C, which has some more bells and whistles. I bought the vanilla version for myself, and you can demo the programs. I'll put the link down in the description below. When they developed this digital audio workstation, they put in everything that I love about analog mixing. I mean, everything. The layout is really straightforward. Everything that you need to get to is right there on the top layer with no menus and no fussing. And that's what I really love about analog mixing. It keeps me in the zone of what I want to do with the mix, not how do I find the parameter that I want to tweak that I thought about a few moments ago, but now I don't really remember anymore because I've been trying to figure out a menu. It's much faster to mix with muscle memory and just grab what you want right when you want it. Now I know this is still mixing with a mouse, so it's not quite that fast, but you can incorporate a fader pack and that's helpful too. Built in on each channel is an EQ, compressor, and routing to every group. Up at the top of the channel strip, you can also see the order on which the processing is done. So if your EQ is before your compressor, you can see that right away. At the very top of the channel strip, you've got your input routing, your record enable, and your monitor select buttons. Here's a pro tip that'll help you go fast. If you hold down Control and Shift while toggling a parameter like record enable or input monitoring, you'll get it to do it for all the channels all at once. So that way you don't have to go click, 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 click all the way down your console. It's especially helpful when switching back and forth between virtual sound check and your live inputs. And hey, if you're like me and learned to mix on an analog console, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. Now the built-in EQ section is different between Mixbus and Mixbus 32C. On Mixbus, you get a 3-band EQ with shelves on the top and bottom and a bell curve in the middle. They're not parametric, or you can't change the bandwidth. They've got an automatic bandwidth control, so the more you cut or boost, the wider the frequency selection goes. There's also a high-pass filter, which is the key to getting a quick mix. Now on Mixbus 32C, you get 4 bands, and the top and bottom bands are switchable between a bell curve and shelving EQ. Now the values for these knobs aren't shown right beside it, but as you're clicking and dragging on the knob, the value shows up on the channel's scribble strips, so you can know exactly what frequency you're cutting and boosting and by how much. Now because the bandwidth is automatic, it's not great for very surgical precision EQ. If you need that, you should load up a plugin. But 99% of the time when you're mixing for broadcast, you're just trying to do a quick musical EQ, these sound great. Now the built-in compression is really great for speed. There's 3 modes. There's a leveler, there's a compressor, and there's a limiter. And with each one, they give you one parameter to tweak, the rest are fixed. So on the leveler, it's a very low ratio with a fixed release time, and you get to choose the attack. On the compressor, the attack and release are fixed, but you get to choose the ratio. And on the limiter, the ratio is very high and the attack is almost instantaneous when you get to choose the release time. Because the controls are simple, you don't get paralysis by analysis, and you can just try something and see if it works. The threshold control and the gain reduction meter are right beside the fader, and the makeup gain is just above that. The gain reduction meter makes it really easy to see when something is getting really crushed, which might be a problem or it might not be. But if something sounds funky and you see a bunch of red lights, it might be the first thing you need to check. Now the channel routing on this digital audio workstation is super simple. You can see how it's all laid out at the top of the channel strip. This is also where you would insert a plugin. Just right click, add new plugin, select which one you want, and you're good to go. Now also of note is you can put these processors after the fader, which might be weird, but most of the time you're probably going to want to keep it before the fader. If you want to copy a setting from one channel to another, just click and drag it over to the other channel. Boom, it's done. You can even add additional DAW-style bus sends on any channel. So if you want to add a ton of effects, or if you want to have an effect in parallel, it doesn't matter. You don't have to use up one of your mix buses for that. You can just create one right there beside the channel. Now we'll talk about the mix buses more in just a minute, but for these bus sends, you can easily choose whether they're pre or post fader by dragging it either above or below the fader. If something's post fader, it's going to be green. If something's pre fader, it'll turn red. Here's another pro tip. Figure out the shortcuts to get things back to their original settings. On some parameters, you double click it. On other ones, you shift click. And why they do that, I'm not sure, but hey, everybody's got their quirks. Now, as far as input channel routing goes, you'll need to make sure that your stereo inputs are on odd even pairs. What that means is that it needs to show up on 7 and 8 for your overhead left and right. It can't show up on 8 and 9 or 6 and 7. It's one of those odd little things, but there's a lot of other consoles that go this way too, so you'll just have to work around it. You can open up the Audio Connections Manager, which acts like a little matrix patch bay, but it also looks like Minesweeper. So if you've played that, you know how dangerous it can be. Mixbus Vanilla comes with 8 stereo mix buses, and Mixbus 32C comes with 12 of them. The last 4 you can even route the first 8 to, which can get kind of crazy and kind of fun all at the same time. On the input channel, go ahead and mash that button with the bus's name on it and you're good to go. It's already routed there. If you want to unassign that input channel from the master bus so that it's only going through the mix bus, click on the master button at the top of the fader. Now these effects buses are post fader and post pan, and on each of them they have a built-in EQ, the same compressor that's on the input channels, and tape emulation. And that's where it gets really cool. Tape saturation is one of the things that I really wish I had every time I'm mixing a broadcast, and here's why. In a broadcast mix, you've got to use a lot of compression to get rid of a lot of the dynamic range that comes from a live performance trying to go out to a really tiny dynamic range that somebody's listening to on their phone in a noisy environment. But sometimes compressors can act funky, especially on inputs that have a whole lot of transients or really big spikes right at the beginning of their sound. Then if you like to use group compression, which I do, and you've got an input that's got a lot of spikes or transients like acoustic guitars or drums, and then other ones that don't have as many transients, you're going to get a big difference between the way that the compressor sees both of those inputs in that mix. What that can do is end up with some pumping artifacts, and that doesn't really sound pleasing. I don't know if you've ever run into it, but if you've ever run into a compressor pumping, type pumping down in the comments below. What the tape saturation does is it knocks off those transients. So even if something spikes coming into it, it just chops off the top of that. It doesn't push down the entire signal like a compressor does. So if you have tape emulation before your compressor, the compressor has a whole lot easier time squashing down on that without getting tripped up or starting with those pumping artifacts. On the mix bus, you can adjust the amount of drive coming from that tape saturation. So it could be a really clean, transparent tape saturation, or you can drive it into dirty, distorted goodness, which doesn't always work in every musical style, but it can be really cool too. The EQ on the mix bus is a simplified version of the channel EQ, so you get some control, but it's really just meant for tone shaping, not for being really surgical. The compressor is the same one that's on the input channel strip, so you're probably already familiar with that. But the thing that I really love about these bus compressors is you can see where the threshold is for each bus relative to the other ones. Now, the other feature about this that's really dear to my heart is that all the buses are time aligned. So you don't have to worry about latency from one processor or another. They've already incorporated all the latency for all the processors built in, so you don't have to worry about having delay between one channel and another when you're processing them in parallel. So if you want your drums to be able to have punch and sustain and be able to vary that with 2 faders, you could assign them to 2 different groups and compress them differently, and then use the faders to balance how much of the punch, how much of the sustain. It's a lot of fun. Now, if you're following along so far and you're getting excited too, go ahead and type bus compression rocks down in the comments below. The master bus has the same compression and the same tape emulation as the rest of the mix buses, but its EQ points are a little bit different. Also built in is a limiter, so if you don't want to peak on your output, you just hit that button and boom, it's done. All of this is post fader, so if you're getting a little bit too hot of a signal to your output, you can just pull the fader back down a little bit.
You stand alone in glory and majesty, stand alone in glory and majesty, stand alone in glory and majesty, stand alone. You stand alone, you stand alone in glory and majesty, stand alone.
The other cool feature is the K14 meter. So if you don't know anything about loudness or different standards, you can just try to put this needle right at the top and you'll be good to go. Now the plugins that are bundled with Mixbus make it so that you don't have to shell out any money on extra stuff. The reverbs and delays are pretty much all you need to get started, and there's also some other fun tools for you to play with and some freeware plugins as well. The only bummer is that there's a bunch of plugins that are installed but not licensed. So when you're trying to find something new, you open it up, you play with it a second, and then the pop-up window comes up and says, "This is an unlicensed version." There's got to be a workaround to hide all the plugins that aren't licensed, but I didn't find it yet. Although there is a favorites plugin folder, which is probably going to be really handy because once you have your go-to plugins, you're probably going to keep using those over and over again, especially because you've got the stock EQ and compression already. Now, one thing that makes it tricky to mix inside a digital audio workstation during a live performance is that you sometimes need to solo something to know what's creating a problem or what's coming up next. You really don't want to use solo in place so that everyone else listens to that acoustic guitar by itself. To overcome this, they've made it really easy to get around in their monitoring section. You can still use solo in place, or you can use PFL or AFL to keep the rest of the mix going to the main output, but routing that soloed channel to your monitor bus. There's also a really handy mono button to see how things sound when they're summed down. The other cool thing is that you can add plugins to your monitoring chain. So if you're mixing in headphones and are using Wave's virtual mix room, you can add that in on there. Or if you're using some room correction EQ for your studio monitors, you can put that there too. Now, one other thing that I like to do is to load up an EQ that I can bypass, but it's got high and low pass filters on it so that it sounds more like a phone. Just be sure you don't do that on your main mix output. So one of the real questions about using this as a live mixer is how reliable is it? When I was doing all my normal mixing functions, I never had any problems with dropouts or blips, except when I was playing audio and loading a new processor or plugin onto that channel. The only way I got it to break and crash was to switch solo modes when I already had a channel solo selected. Every piece of software and every piece of hardware is gonna have glitches eventually, so you're just gonna have to learn the quirks and try to work around them. It's just one of the risks you take when you're using software. When it comes to things that I might improve, I think I'd have to use this software for a long time before I could come up with anything substantial. The only thing that I couldn't get to work the way that I thought it maybe should have was the snapshots function. I know that's a new feature on another digital audio workstation, so I might have had high expectations for that, but I would love to be able to switch between settings really quickly for different songs without having to interrupt any of the audio. Now, between all the features built into every channel and the way that it's just logically laid out and organized, it's simple enough that even volunteers can figure it out. And it's robust enough that a pro can make a great mix really quickly. Of course, I don't think they had this particular purpose in mind when they were designing it, but it actually works really well. So if you use it this way and it breaks and you reach out to Harrison, just be kind with them. They didn't exactly design it for this. Bottom line, there's an elegance and simplicity, and they nailed it on this one. It's easy to work in, and it sounds great. What more could you want? Hey, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit subscribe and ding the little bell to get notified every time I post a new video. Be sure to check out my other broadcast mixing tutorials, and we'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.